My family forged my grandmother's will to cut me out of a $4 million inheritance. They did not know Grandma had a secret second will and a lawyer who was ready for war. When my grandmother passed away, my family told me she left me nothing. My uncle read her will at the kitchen table and said I was not even mentioned. Everyone got houses, land, and cash. I got silence. But what they did not know was that my grandmother had warned me this would happen, and she spent the last 2 years of her life making sure they could never ever get away with it. Let me tell you about my grandmother, because she is the real hero of this story. Not me. Her. Her name was Eleanor, but everyone called her Ellie. She was 86 years old when she passed, and she was the sharpest, most stubborn, most fiercely loving woman I have ever known. She grew up dirt poor in a small farming town in the Midwest. Her family did not have much, but they had work ethic and they had each other, and Ellie carried both of those things like armor her entire life. She married my grandfather, Walter, when she was 19. He was 21, just back from the service, with big hands and a quiet voice and a dream about owning property. Together, they scraped and saved, and bought their first rental house when they were 25. It was a beat-up 2-bedroom on the rough side of town, and they fixed it up themselves, every nail, every coat of paint, every patched roof tile. They rented it out, saved the income, bought another one, then another. Over 50 years, Ellie and Walter built a small real estate portfolio that, through patience and smart decisions and sheer determination, grew into something genuinely impressive. By the time Walter passed away in 2015, their combined assets were worth approximately $4 million. Multiple residential properties, savings accounts, investment accounts, and one piece of commercial land on the edge of town, that alone was appraised at $1.2 million. Walter's will was straightforward and simple. Everything went to Ellie. No drama, no complications, no family fights. Walter trusted his wife completely, and so did everyone else, at least while he was still alive. But after Walter passed, the dynamics in our family shifted in ways that were ugly and undeniable. Because my grandmother had 3 children, and 2 of them were, to put it politely, the kind of people who counted other people's money. My mother, Karen, was the youngest of the 3 siblings. She was kind, generous, and genuinely close with Ellie in a way that had nothing to do with money. She never asked about the inheritance, never hinted at what she hoped to receive, and she visited Grandma every single weekend just to sit on the porch and talk. Sometimes they would cook together. Ellie's famous pot roast or her blackberry cobbler that was honestly so good it should have been illegal. My mom raised me on her own after my dad left when I was 6, and Ellie helped us out when she could. A few hundred here, a bag of groceries there, covering my school supplies in September. But my mom always insisted on earning her own way. She was a nurse who worked 12-hour shifts and never once complained. Honest to the bone, humble to a fault, the best person I have ever known. Then there was Uncle Richard, the middle child. Richard was what my grandmother called a man who spends $1 to look like he has 10. He ran a car dealership that was perpetually, mysteriously on the verge of bankruptcy despite supposedly bringing in impressive revenue. The numbers never added up, but Richard always had an excuse: the economy, the competition, supply chain issues, bad luck. Meanwhile, he wore expensive Italian suits, drove a different luxury car every 6 months, and lived in a house with 5 bedrooms and a pool that he absolutely could not afford. His wife Deborah was basically a female version of Richard, loud, flashy, and completely obsessed with appearances. Together they had 2 kids, my cousins Tyler and Brittany, who were as spoiled and entitled as their parents raised them to be. Tyler drove a car that cost more than my mom's annual salary. Brittany had a closet bigger than my bedroom. None of them had ever worked a hard day in their lives. Then there was Aunt Patricia, the oldest. Patricia married into money in her 30s, divorced out of it in her 40s when her husband caught her having an affair, and spent the next 2 decades living off her divorce settlement while complaining to anyone who would listen that life had been unfair to her. She had 1 daughter, my cousin Megan, who was a perfect carbon copy of her mother, always the victim, always deserving of more, and always keeping score. As long as Grandpa Walter was alive, everyone behaved. Walter was a quiet man, but he had a presence that commanded respect, and nobody dared to be petty or greedy in front of him. But after he died, Richard and Patricia started circling Ellie like vultures over a cornfield. They visited more often, which sounds nice until you realize the visits always steered toward the same topics. Richard would mention how difficult the economy was for his dealership, and how helpful it would be to get a head start on estate planning. Patricia would show up with flowers, and within 20 minutes would be asking Ellie about the properties, who was inheriting what, whether she had updated her paperwork. They were not visiting their mother, they were auditing her. I was 24 when Grandpa died, and I was the only grandchild who had a genuine, untainted relationship with Ellie. I visited her 3 times a week, sometimes more, not for money, not because I was angling for a piece of the estate, but because I genuinely loved being around her. She was the most interesting person I knew. We would sit on her porch with lemonade and she would tell me stories about growing up during the Depression, about how she and Walter met at a church dance, about the first property they bought and how terrified they were signing the mortgage papers. She would tell me about the mistakes they made, the tenants who trashed their houses, the time they almost lost everything in the recession of 2008, but held on because Walter refused to panic sell. She was a walking library of life lessons, and I soaked up every single word. About a year after Grandpa passed, Ellie started telling me things that made my stomach drop. She said Richard was pressuring her to simplify her estate by signing over certain properties to him immediately, to avoid probate taxes, which is not even really how estate taxes work, but Richard was counting on Ellie not knowing that. She said Patricia was constantly bringing up the will, asking pointed questions about who was getting what, and suggesting that the smart and fair thing to do would be to divide everything equally among the 3 children and leave the grandchildren out of the estate entirely. Convenient, since Patricia had already spent most of what she got from her divorce. My mom never participated in any of this scheming. She actually told Ellie, point blank, "Mom, do whatever you want with your money. It is yours. You earned it. I do not need a penny." That was just who my mom was. But it also meant she was not fighting back against Richard and Patricia, who were absolutely fighting for every dollar and fighting dirty. Ellie saw everything. She was old, but she was not naive. She was not confused. She was not declining. Her mind was razor sharp right up until the end, and she saw exactly what her 2 oldest children were doing. She saw the greed, the manipulation, the fake visits and the real agendas behind them. One autumn afternoon, when I was visiting her alone on the porch, she reached over and grabbed my hand with a grip that was surprisingly strong for an 84-year-old woman. She looked me dead in the eyes and said something that sent chills down my spine. "Nathan, when I am gone, your uncle and your aunt are going to try to take everything. They are going to cut you and your mother out. I know it as surely as I know my own name, but I need you to listen to me very carefully. I am not going to let that happen. Your grandfather and I spent 50 years building something real, and I will not let it go to people who only show up when they want something." I told her not to worry about it. I said I did not care about the money, that I just wanted her to be happy and healthy. She squeezed my hand even harder and shook her head. "It is not about the money, sweetheart. It is about what is right. It is about honoring what your grandfather and I built. Promise me you will not let them win." I promised. I had no idea what she had already set in motion. What I did not know, what nobody in the family knew, was that Ellie had already spent months carefully and quietly building her defense. She had hired her own lawyer, completely independently, without telling a soul. The lawyer's name was Judith Brennan, a sharp-eyed estate attorney with 30 years of experience in trust and probate law. Ellie found Judith through a recommendation from her longtime accountant, who she trusted implicitly. She chose Judith specifically because Judith had absolutely no connection to anyone in our family. No social ties, no professional overlap, nothing. This was critical because Richard had been aggressively pushing Ellie to use his friend Greg, a local attorney who handled the legal work for Richard's car dealership. Richard kept saying, "Mom, just let Greg handle it. He is a great guy. He will take care of everything." Ellie smiled and nodded every time Richard brought it up, told him she would think about it, and then drove herself to Judith Brennan's office the very next morning. With Judith's help, Ellie created a comprehensive, legally airtight estate plan. But it was not just a will. It was a living trust, which is a legal structure that allows assets to be transferred to beneficiaries without going through the public probate process. No court hearing, no opportunity for someone to walk into a courtroom and contest the distribution. No delay, no drama, and critically, no chance for Richard and Patricia to interfere. Ellie funded the trust with her most valuable assets, the commercial property worth $1.2 million, the majority of her savings and investment accounts, and 2 of the better residential rental properties. The trust named 3 beneficiaries, my mother Karen, me, and a local children's charity called Bright Horizons that Ellie had been quietly donating to for over 20 years. The charity served kids from low-income families, the same kind of families Ellie and Walter had come from, and supporting it was deeply personal to her. Richard and Patricia were not left with nothing. That was important to Ellie. Despite everything, they were still her children. She gave each of them 1 rental property, modest but decent houses valued at about $200,000 each. Combined, they were getting $400,000 in real estate. That was generous by any standard. But the bulk of the estate, approximately $3.4 million in total value, was locked inside the trust. Here is the part that still gives me chills. Ellie told no one about the trust. Not my mother. Not me. Not Richard. Not Patricia. Not a single human being outside of Judith Brennan's office. She also deliberately kept a different, older will visible in her house. This was a previous version of her estate plan, one she had drafted years earlier, that divided things more evenly among her 3 children. She left it in her desk drawer, not hidden but not displayed, knowing that when she passed, Richard would go looking. She left it there on purpose. It was bait. Ellie passed away peacefully in her sleep on a Thursday in March. She was 86. The doctor said her heart simply gave out during the night. She did not suffer. She went the way she lived, quietly and on her own terms. I was devastated. I cried for 3 days straight. My mother was wrecked. We spent the week after the funeral sitting on Ellie's porch, going through old photo albums, drinking her favorite tea, and just being together in our grief. It was the hardest week of my life. Richard and Patricia, on the other hand, could barely disguise their eagerness. At the funeral, I overheard Richard whispering to Deborah near the coat rack about getting this whole thing sorted quickly. Patricia was in the church parking lot on her phone, talking to someone about the timeline for distribution. They wore dark clothes and somber faces, but the performance was thin. Everyone could see through it. Even the pastor noticed, pulling my mother aside after the service to ask if everything was all right with the family. 2 weeks after the funeral, Richard announced he was calling a family meeting at Ellie's house. He set the time, set the location, and arrived looking like a man who had already decided how the rest of the conversation would go. He stood at the kitchen table, the same table where Ellie had cooked us 1,000 meals, and pulled out a document. He said, with this theatrical, practiced gravity in his voice, "I found Mom's will in her desk. I think it is important that we go through it together, as a family, so everyone knows where things stand." He read it aloud. According to this document, Richard received the commercial property, which was by far the most valuable single asset. Patricia received 2 of the rental properties. My mother received 1 rental property, the smallest and least valuable one in Ellie's portfolio. And I was not mentioned at all. Not a dollar, not a word, nothing. I sat at that table in stunned silence. My mother looked confused and hurt, but too gracious to make a scene at her own mother's kitchen table. Something felt profoundly, deeply wrong. I had spent years with my grandmother, heard her talk about fairness and doing the right thing, listened to her promise, while squeezing my hand on that porch, that she would take care of us. There was no way in the world she would have left things like this. Not a chance. That does not seem right, I said, keeping my voice steady. Grandma would not have done this. Richard put on his concerned but firm face and said, "I know this is hard to hear, Nathan. Believe me, I wish it were different, but this is what Mom wanted. She was very clear about it. The document is right here." Patricia chimed in. Mom was getting older. She probably just wanted to keep things simple. 3 children, 3 portions. It makes sense. I looked at the document again. Something about the formatting was off. The font looked different in certain sections. Dates seemed strange, but I could not put my finger on it in the moment, and I did not want to cause a scene that would upset my mother more than she already was. We left that evening with Richard clutching the document like it was a winning lottery ticket. My mother drove home in silence. She did not cry. She just looked tired, bone tired, the way only grief mixed with betrayal can make you feel. That night I could not sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my head. Grandma's words on the porch, the promise she made me, the intensity in her eyes, and then I remembered something, a business card. Months earlier I had helped Ellie clean out her bedroom closet, and I had seen a business card tucked into a shoebox on the top shelf. White card, clean font. I remembered it because Ellie had been oddly specific about that shoebox. "Do not throw that box away, Nathan. That one is important." First thing the next morning, I drove to Ellie's house, let myself in with the spare key she had given me years ago, and went straight to the bedroom closet. The shoebox was still there. Inside, under a few old photographs and a dried flower that looked like it came from her wedding bouquet, was the business card. It read, "Judith Brennan, Attorney at Law, Trusts and Estates." There was a phone number and an office address in a town about 30 minutes away. I called immediately. When I identified myself, Judith's voice changed from professional to warm in an instant. "Nathan," she said, "I have been waiting to hear from you. Your grandmother told me you would call. Can you come to my office today?" I drove to Judith's office in a daze, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. When I got there, she sat me down in a comfortable leather chair across from her desk. poured me a cup of tea and told me everything, every single detail. About the trust, about the real estate plan, about how Ellie had spent 2 years, 2 full years, working with Judith to create an ironclad structure that could not be tampered with, contested, or circumvented. About how Ellie had specifically and intentionally left the old will in her desk as a trap, knowing with absolute certainty that Richard would find it and try to use it. Your grandmother was an extraordinary woman, Judith said, and there was genuine admiration in her voice. She came to me 2 years ago and said, "My son is going to try to steal from his own mother's grave. I want you to make sure he cannot." And that is exactly what we did. But the revelations were not over. Judith told me that after Ellie's death, she had followed the legal protocol and obtained a copy of the will Richard presented to the family through county records. She had it professionally analyzed by a forensic document examiner, a specialist who testifies in federal court. The examiner's findings were damning. The will Richard showed the family was not just the outdated version Ellie had left in her desk. It had been altered. Multiple sections had been modified, including the distribution of the commercial property, which in the original version of that will had been left to my mother, not Richard. Signatures had been digitally manipulated, with evidence of cut-and-paste editing visible under magnification. Dates had been changed. Paragraphs had been added that were not present in the original document. Richard had found the old will, realized it still did not give him everything he wanted, and then forged it to make it even more favorable to himself. He had not just tried to use an outdated document. He had committed felony document forgery. Judith had already been in contact with the district attorney's office. Forging a will is not a slap on the wrist. In our state, it is a Class C felony punishable by up to 10 years in prison and significant fines. Richard was not just facing civil consequences. He was looking at criminal prosecution. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Judith leaned back in her chair and smiled. It was a calm, confident, terrifying smile. The smile of a woman who had been waiting for this exact moment for 2 years. "Now," she said, "we execute the trust exactly as your grandmother intended, and we let Richard discover what happens when you try to steal from a woman who was always 3 steps ahead of you." The trust was executed within the month. Because it was a properly funded living trust, it bypassed the probate process entirely. There was no public hearing, no court date, no opportunity for Richard or Patricia to challenge the distribution. Judith simply transferred the assets to the named beneficiaries according to the terms Ellie had established 2 years earlier. Clean, legal, and completely unchallengeable. My mother received the family home, the house where she had spent her childhood and where she sat on the porch every weekend with Ellie, plus approximately $900,000 in cash and investments. I received the commercial property, appraised at $1.2 million plus about $500,000 in savings and investment accounts. The children's charity Bright Horizons received the remainder, totaling about $800,000. The 2 rental properties Ellie had earmarked for Richard and Patricia were distributed as originally intended in the trust, one each, valued at about $200,000 apiece. Richard found out when he went to the county recorder's office to begin the transfer of the commercial property, the crown jewel he had forged documents to claim. The clerk told him the property had already been transferred. To me, it was in my name, legally, officially, and irrevocably. He called me screaming that same afternoon. Not just angry, unhinged. "What did you do? That property is mine. Mom left it to me. I have the will." "You have a forged document, Richard," I said, and I was surprised at how calm my voice sounded. "And I have a trust that Grandma set up with her own attorney 2 years ago. The real attorney, not the dealership lawyer you kept trying to push on her." The silence on the other end lasted about 10 seconds. Then he said, "This is not over, Nathan." But it was. It absolutely was. Because Judith had already filed the criminal complaint. 3 weeks later, Richard was formally charged with forgery, fraud, and attempted theft by deception. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The forensic document analysis, Judith's testimony about the real estate plan, the original unaltered will that proved the changes Richard had made, and the trust documents that showed Ellie's true intentions. Patricia was not charged criminally, but she was named in the civil action our attorney filed for attempting to benefit knowingly from a fraudulent instrument. She settled quickly and quietly for about $60,000 in legal fees and costs. She also lost the second rental property she thought was coming to her. Under the actual trust, Patricia was a beneficiary of only 1 property, not 2. The additional property she expected went to Bright Horizons instead. Ellie had specifically reduced Patricia's share because of her behavior after Walter's death, and she documented the reasons in a letter attached to the trust. Richard pleaded guilty to forgery and fraud as part of a plea agreement. He was sentenced to 2 years of supervised probation, 400 hours of community service, and was ordered to pay full restitution to all victims, including me, my mother, and the charity. The total restitution was over $120,000. His car dealership, already teetering on the edge of insolvency, could not survive the scandal and the legal fees. His business partner bought him out for a fraction of what his share was worth. Deborah filed for divorce 3 months after the sentencing. His kids, Tyler and Brittany, stopped speaking to him when the trust fund he had promised them evaporated along with everything else. I want to be honest. I did not enjoy watching Richard's life disintegrate. He was my uncle. We had shared Thanksgiving dinners, birthday parties, Christmas mornings with wrapping paper everywhere, and Ellie's cobbler cooling on the counter. There was a time when Richard taught me how to throw a football in the backyard and bought me my first baseball glove. That man existed once, somewhere inside the person who forged his own mother's will. But greed hollowed him out over the years, replaced the uncle I loved with a stranger who chose money over everything that actually mattered. And strangers who commit crimes face consequences. That is just how it works. My mother used her inheritance to pay off her mortgage, set up a retirement fund, and reduce her hours at the hospital. After decades of breaking her back on 12-hour nursing shifts, she finally had room to breathe. She started volunteering at the church, took up watercolor painting, and began traveling to places she had always wanted to see but could never afford. She went to Italy last spring and sent me a photo of herself eating gelato on a bridge in Florence with the biggest smile I have ever seen on her face. Ellie would have loved that photo. She would have framed it and put it on the mantle. I used the commercial property to build something meaningful. I renovated the building and opened a community workspace and cafe that I named Ellie's. It is a place where people can work, study, create, and connect. We host community events, support local small businesses, and donate a portion of every month's profits to Bright Horizons, the same charity Grandma supported for 20 years. The building has a bronze plaque by the front door that reads, "In loving memory of Eleanor, who built something real and made sure it went to the right people." Every single time I walk through that door, I think about my grandmother, about the 2 years she spent quietly, patiently, brilliantly constructing a plan that would protect her family even after she was gone, about how she sat across the kitchen table from Richard and Patricia for months, listening to their scheming and their fake concern, and never once let on that she had already outsmarted them 10 moves ahead, about how she trusted me enough to leave one single breadcrumb, a business card in a shoebox in a closet, knowing I would find it when the time was right. Grandma did not get to see the final chapter play out. She did not get to see Richard's face when the county clerk told him the property was already in my name. She did not get to see my mother finally at peace, painting watercolors and eating gelato in Italy. She did not get to see Ellie's, the building that carries her name and serves her community. But I believe with every fiber of my being that she knew. I think she sat in Judith's office on the day she signed those trust documents, set down the pen, folded her hands in her lap, and smiled, because she could already see exactly how the whole thing would play out. She had always been able to see further down the road than anyone else in the family. That was her gift, and this was her masterpiece. Some people believe karma is random, that it is just the universe evening things out on its own, unpredictable schedule. But sometimes, karma does not wait for the universe to get around to it. Sometimes an 84-year-old woman in a small house in the Midwest, with a sharp mind and a carefully chosen lawyer, builds karma into the system herself. She notarizes it, timestamps it, funds it, seals it in an irrevocable trust, and tucks a breadcrumb into a shoebox where only the right person will find it at exactly the right time. Richard thought he could outsmart his own mother. He thought a forged signature and a kitchen table performance would be enough to steal what was not his. He forgot the most fundamental truth about Eleanor. She always had a plan, and her plans always worked. About 6 months after everything settled, I got a letter in the mail from Richard, not an email. A handwritten letter on plain white paper. No envelope from a fancy dealership. No embossed letterhead. Just a man and a pen and paper. He wrote that he was sorry. He wrote that he knew an apology was not enough, and probably never would be. He said that after losing the dealership and Deborah and the respect of his own kids, he had started seeing a therapist, someone who was helping him understand why he spent his entire adult life chasing money and status, instead of building real relationships. He said the therapist asked him when it started, the obsession with being the one who had the most, and he could not answer. He just knew that somewhere along the way he stopped seeing people as people and started seeing them as obstacles or opportunities, including his own mother. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not ask for money. He did not ask for anything. He just said he wanted me to know that he understood what he did, and he was living with the consequences every day, and he hoped one day he could be someone his mother would not be ashamed of. I read the letter twice and put it in a drawer. I did not respond. Not because I am holding a grudge, but because some things do not need a response. The letter was for Richard, not for me. It was part of his process, his reckoning, his long road back to whatever version of himself might still be worth saving. I hope he finds it. I genuinely do. But my focus is on the people and things that deserve my energy. The business, my mother, the community Ellie loved, the legacy she built with her bare hands and protected with her brilliant mind. I miss my grandmother every single day, but I honor her every single day too, by running a business that gives back, by taking care of my mother, and by remembering the lesson Ellie taught me with her final, most brilliant, most loving act. The people who play the long game, who build with patience and integrity and love, are the ones who win in the end, always.